Alright guys, welcome back to the second part of your Period 4 review video. To refresh your memories, if you took a little break between video 1 and 2, we've just covered the consequences and effects of the War of 1812, the era of good feelings, Monroe's presidency, as well as the Missouri Compromise, which demonstrates really an end to the era of good feelings as sectionalism flares up. And we have to have a really spirited debate over not the issue of slavery necessarily, but expansion of slavery. Now, continuing with our theme of overlapping revolutions throughout period 4, we have a significant revolution, a big change in terms of how we manufacture, how we make manufactured goods, as well as how we farm. And both of these changes are really going to be driven by new technology. Technology is going to increase both the efficiency of our production, how much we can produce in the same amount of time, and also how far away we can sell those goods. We're going to extend our markets and become much more of a market economy instead of a local economy. So now we're going to be able to produce goods for markets far away based on supply and demand and become a much more interconnected economy as a nation. Now, some of those pieces of technology you guys should note, textile machines. And the early factory system is brought over from Great Britain by a man named Samuel Slater. He actually smuggles the plans for a factory out of Great Britain. It's a secret that Great Britain wanted to keep secret, to keep a monopoly on, because they're the only real nation in the world that has a factory system. But that comes to the U.S. and manifests itself largely in the more industrialized Northeast through their textile factories. And of course, that increases production. Another huge change in period 4 that really fuels a lot of the market extension is the steam engines. So now we're seeing boats that can both go up and down river, which seems really dumb now in 2018, but it's a big deal in 1825, 1828, 1830, that now we can ship things up river, largely north instead of just down river and to the ocean. It really interconnects the world and shrinks the world in a significant way. Also, which encouraging changes in manufacturing and agriculture is the idea of interchangeable parts. It really begins with Eli Whitney with a variety of different mechanisms. But the idea that when you make a machine, you shouldn't make it so that if one piece breaks, the entire thing is useless, but rather you can replace that part. And it allows for mass production of goods. It allows for less capital, less money to get involved in manufacturing because it's cheaper to replace things. We see a huge growth of canals. So building in infrastructure to be able to trade things farther away. The one you should know is the Erie Canal in New York. Eventually, we see railroads later at the tail end of the 1840s, which is going to actually hurt canals, but really replace those in terms of our growth of infrastructure. We see the telegraph as an important piece of technology that influences agriculture and manufacturing because it makes it easier to communicate over far distances, which enables us to better account for supply and demand. As well as a whole bunch of inventions that are going to increase production in agriculture. The mechanical reaper, eventually the steel plow, and as you guys know, incredibly important, the cotton gin, which is going to enable the South to make cotton a much more profitable plant, which beginning in the 1810s, 20s, and 30s is going to cause the South to really double down on the institution of slavery because cotton has become so profitable that there's no economic feasibility in getting rid of slavery. But mass production of goods is really going to be replacing what largely was the American economy up to this point, which was semi-subsistence farming. Farming what you can, using your surplus of farm goods for what you can't grow, and our economy is going to become much more developed, modern, and interconnected than it was before. Now, in this piece, we have a very important development for women with the Lowell system in Lowell, Massachusetts. Which we see for the first time women working outside the home, women living outside the home on their own. In theory, it's supposed to be women being educated. That part happens much less. But it does show some semblance of economic independence for women. And during this market revolution, we do see women marriage rates decline. We see women having their mates chosen for them declining as women start developing some sense of independence due to their economic role. But all these changes are going to really lead to what's called regional specialization, in which one region really plays a single role in a more interconnected economy. New England, the Northeast, is going to become much more industrialized with their textile factories that are going to be largely powered by water. So much of these early industrial processes are located on rivers and streams in New England. The South, as I pointed out, is going to double down or reinvest in cotton as their role in the economy. They're going to be providing the raw materials for this textile mechanization in New England. And the west and north of the Ohio River in the old Northwest Territory and elsewhere has become much more of the breadbasket for America, farming the grain and the corn and the things that are going to feed the country, while New England worries about creating textiles and the South worries about cotton. Now, the impacts of this market revolution are pretty clear. First, westward expansion. When the world shrinks, it makes it easier for people to get west, and that makes it a more feasible option for people. All of these canals make it easier for trade, which makes moving west more profitable than it would be otherwise. New roads, new technology, new steamboats, all of that's going to encourage a smoother westward transition, which is going to encourage more people. We're also going to see a huge growth of immigrants. This is what's going to eventually be called old immigration. We're seeing the Irish coming in great numbers. They're going to settle largely in the east in cities like New York and Boston. We're seeing a lot of Germans coming as well. They're going to settle more in the Midwest, in the Minnesotas, and other places in Ohio as well. They're going to settle more as farmers. And there's a whole bunch of stuff happening in Europe that's going to encourage them to leave. Economic hardships, specifically the potato famine in Ireland. And then also some similar reasons for that from that first wave of immigration during colonialism, in that there's not enough land in Europe, there's not enough economic opportunities in Europe, and because the U.S. economy is growing, there are more economic and job opportunities in the U.S. as well as an abundance of land. The U.S. has far more land than it has people, and that's going to be a big pull factor for the U.S. Another clear impact of the market revolution is there is a much more dependence between the Northeast and the Northwest. So the West, what was the Northwest Territory and the old New England region, as well as the middle colonies, are going to become much more interconnected economically as they rely on each other, and the South can be kind of left out by their own doing of this industrialization. So as we come to a close of the market revolution, it's clear that we understand the South is still incredibly different than the other two regions. The South is relying fully on cotton exportation. They really are a single crop economy. They're relying fully on forced unpaid labor. And the South really, during the market revolution, begins to be identified as the quote unquote South that we're going to know about Civil War time. That is fully invested on defending slavery at all costs, really, and fully dependent on one crop for their economy. A couple other changes because of the market revolution. Like any industrial change like this, you're going to have an increased gap between the rich and the poor. The rich that can afford to fund industrialism and own factories and companies are going to become richer. But we do here, for the first time in American history, start to see the emergence of a middle working class. People that are definitely not poor, but definitely not rich, that are working in the industrial world and doing so successfully. For the first time in American history, we see a clear separation between home and work. Up to this point, most people lived and worked on small farms at home. This is the first time we start seeing people, men specifically, but also women to a smaller extent, going to work somewhere outside of the home. So there's this nice, clear separation between what's happening at home and what's happening at work. We see some changes in gender and family roles, as this is when we start to see the rise of the cult of domesticity, as women, once they start coming out of the home to work, are encouraged to instead return home and really manage and own that sphere. And for many Americans, beginning in this time and going forward, we're going to see a growth in sectional tension as people are going to identify more with their region and with their country as a whole. We're going to see that sectional tension seen largely through four issues. The first is slavery. Of course, that is going to really be ignored for much of American history, but it's going to flare up from time to time, like the Missouri Compromise, like the Compromise of 1850, and so forth. We're going to see the issue rising of sectionalism over the national bank, which is strongly disliked in the South, but preferred in the more manufacturing Northeast. We're going to see the sectional issue manifesting itself over tariffs, which are, of course, favored in the North because it benefits their manufacturing and very disliked in the South because it makes their costs rise. And we're going to see issues manifesting themselves over the ideas of internal improvements, canals, roads, bridges, eventually railroads, with the thinking of the tariffs would pay for them. And they're definitely favored in the West, as the West looks at them as their link to the rest of the country. And largely not favored in the South, as the South prefers to rely on their system of navigable rivers and thinks they don't need railroads. But of course, as you guys know, that will bite them in the ass later when they can't move their things around during the Civil War. Now, speaking of Henry Clay and these ideas of using tariffs to fund internal improvements, it's also important that we understand the role of Clay's quote-unquote American system. Now, Clay's American system never actually happens as a unified system, but chunks of it happen and play an important role in the growth of infrastructure in the 1820s and 30s. But Clay's American system is really Congress's attempt or try to unite the U.S. economically, politically, and socially. They're going to do so by a national transportation system, something that actually doesn't really happen until Lincoln with the Pacific Railway Act, and then later with Eisenhower and the National Highway Act. But be able to connect the country through roads, canals, steamships, and rivers. And we do see a huge growth between 1800 and 1850 of all of these things, these early mass forms of transportation. Clay's American system is supposed to provide for economic growth and encouraging Americans to buy stuff from America so that America can become more self-sufficient economically instead of continuing to rely on Great Britain. And to do so, Clay proposes the use of a protective tariff, making overseas imported goods more expensive to force people to buy stuff from America. And we see that through the proposed and ratified tariff of 1816. And then into the 1820s, those other tariffs that really matter, 1828, which is called, of course, in South Carolina, the Tariff of Abominations. And then a series of other tariffs through the 1820s and 30s that are going to cause a bunch of tension in the South, but are going to promote American industry. Clay also proposes and does help recharter a second edition of the Bank of the United States to promote a stronger economy, to promote investment, to promote economic stability, and that second bank is rechartered or renewed in 1816. So, through this time period, we have what's known as the Era of Good Feelings because the Federalists die. Why did the Federalists die? We talked about that in the Period 4 Part 1 video. It's their lack of appeal to the middle and lower classes, and as we allow the middle and lower classes to begin voting, of course, they're not going to side with Federalist ideas, but it's also because some Democrats have really adopted the Federalist ideas on things like the bank, which, as you guys saw with Clay, is just rechartered. So the Federalists die out, and their last real stand is the Hartford Convention, which was covered in the last video. Under Monroe's presidency, we have American nationalism. After the War of 1812, we're proud of our country. We see the Monroe Doctrine, worth pointing out as the first real foreign policy initiative in American history other than Washington's farewell address, which warns Europe to stay out of our trouble. And then we have the real ending of the Era of Good Feelings because of the Panic of 1819 and the Missouri Compromise, and then finally, in a couple of slides, the Corrupt Bargain. We have a couple important foreign policy successes in this time period. Under Monroe, the Rush-Bagot Treaty, which demilitarizes the Great Lakes region. It really is one of the first in a long series of examples of foreign policy being settled diplomatically as opposed to militarily. And it really does start to set up a really strong, solid relationship between the U.S. and Great Britain as this takes place without any blood being shed or any real tension. In 1818, we decide with Great Britain the following year to share the Oregon Territory for the time being and just deal with that problem later. So for the next 30 or some years, the Oregon Territory, way out on the west coast in the northwest, is jointly occupied by Great Britain and the U.S. Then finally, the Adams-Onis Treaty, very important as well, negotiated by John Quincy Adams in his role as Secretary of State for James Monroe to purchase Florida from Spain. So in the Era of Good Feelings, we don't have any military conflicts. We're really settling our problems diplomatically, and that's a big deal. But of course, this Era of Good Feelings comes to an end with those two events I mentioned prior, the Panic of 1819, which causes economic turmoil, the Missouri Compromise over the expansion of slavery, which causes social turmoil, and then finally the Corrupt Bargain of 1824, which causes political turmoil. As you see here from this election map, we have our election of 1824, and here we have four major candidates. Now, as you guys know, this is still considered the quote-unquote Era of Good Feelings, so they all technically represent the Democratic Republicans. However, by now the Democratic Republicans have split into a more national power type of branch, led by people like John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, and a more states' rights-y faction in the legacy of Thomas Jefferson, led by people like Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun. Now, as you can see from this map, no candidate gets the majority of the electoral vote and no candidate gets the majority of the popular vote. So, as you can see, Jackson wins the most popular votes and the most electoral votes, but neither puts him over 50%. And anytime we don't have a candidate that gets over 50% in the Electoral College, Congress has to decide who the president is going to be, and they have to pick from the top three candidates. So that leaves Quincy Adams, Jackson, and Crawford, and it eliminates Clay from the conversation. Now, of course, this puts Clay in a tough position because A, he just finished fourth in a presidential election, but B, he serves as Speaker of the House of Representatives, so he has incredible sway and influence on who Congress is going to pick. What happens is Clay uses his platform in Congress to convince Congress to vote for John Quincy Adams, despite the fact that Quincy Adams only had 31% of the popular vote and 32% electoral vote. And 2 weeks later, now that Quincy Adams is president on Congress's approval, Quincy Adams names Clay as his Secretary of State. Now, there's no written record of there being a real behind closed doors secret deal of this, but it looks super shady in the first place. Up to this point, a ton of our early presidents were Secretary of States first and then presidents afterwards. We can look at Jefferson, we can look at Madison, we can look at Monroe, and we can look at now John Quincy Adams as people that went from Secretary of State to president. So this looks almost as if Clay traded the presidency in 1824 for the chance to be Secretary of State and then president later. This makes Jackson's supporters very angry, and it makes for a very doomed president, a very short one-term doomed presidency for Quincy Adams, as the states' rights faction of the Democratic Party is going to make life kind of miserable on him. But this really is the final piece that divides the Democrat Party and ends this era of good feelings. Now, under Adams' administration, we have a couple noteworthy things that I want you guys to make sure you're aware of. Of course, the continued implementation of Clay's American system, as Quincy Adams is going to push for more infrastructure, continue the bank, and tariffs. In 1828, Quincy Adams' administration, on their way out after losing the election of 1828, is going to pass what's called the Tariff of Abominations. In South Carolina's terms, the highest tariff at that point in American history. That's going to make the South very upset. A much more generous Indian policy of not Indian removal, of not Indian punishment, of cohabitation and reimbursement for the Indians for their land, all of which is going to anger the Jacksonian Democrats that are largely in the South and the West that are going to dislike this and dislike this. So Quincy Adams serves for 4 years. As you can see here in this lovely picture, he's not an attractive man, but it is cool to note that he is the first president to be photographed. This is obviously after his term in office. He's a very old man at that point, but the first president to have been photographed. 4 years later, Jackson comes back for what he thought was his in 1824 anyway, and wins a real groundbreaking election in 1828. It represents a real new era in American history, as he's considered the first quote-unquote common man to be president. Now, he's not quite a common man. He's a large slave owner. He's very rich, but he comes from very little. He comes from nothing, and that then allows him to identify with the common man of American society. His party, the Jacksonian Democrats, or just the Democrats from this point forward, are going to take advantage of the fact that we've really removed in almost every state the requirement to own property to vote, which allows a new class of people to vote. Every white male, for the most part, is going to be able to vote, and they're going to identify more with Jackson than the national power Democrats like John Quincy Adams. And he's going to use his time in the White House to greatly expand the powers of the presidency. And this issues in a really important new era in American history in which we can look at people that are still playing a huge role from a variety of perspectives on, as you can see over here, the more liberalistic point of view with a stronger, active, more involved federal government, all the way over here to the firm states' rights supporters. So yes, we still have John Marshall. He's still alive, believe it or not, as this old Federalist, big-time national supremacy type of dude. He's still Chief Justice until 1835. We have these more national power type of Democratic Republicans who will eventually become the Whigs in a couple years, like Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. We have the Jacksonian Democrats like Jackson and his vice president and next president, Martin Van Buren, who are mostly states' rights in their philosophy and thinking, but they do side with federal government authority in some cases, like Indian removal. And then we have to the far right the full crazy states' rights Southern Democrats like John C. Calhoun. Now, Jackson has 2 terms. And three major concerns in those terms. I'll go over all three of them. The first issue is Native Americans and the removal of them. The second is tariffs and what tension comes from that. And the third is the National Bank, which, as you guys know, was rechartered in 1816 and is still around. But also importantly, from a precedent standpoint, Jackson, as kind of the new guy in Washington, D.C., is going to appoint all of his friends to positions in the government. This is going to be called eventually the spoil system, that idea of to the victor goes the spoils. It's going to put a bunch of new blood into Washington, D.C., which is important, but a bunch of also very unqualified people into Washington, D.C., which is not quite as good. Eventually, this spoil system is going to evolve into what's called patronage, a very important theme and issue that we'll be retackling in Period 6, but it's important to note that it really starts with this idea from Jackson and the spoil system, of putting his loyal supporters around him in government jobs, whether they're qualified or not. Now, under Jackson, we see the passage of the Indian Removal Act, which is passed in 1830 to get rid of the Native Americans and have them removed all the way west of the Mississippi to Oklahoma, at the time what was called Indian Country. Jackson tries to justify it both to himself and the public as being safer and a better option for the Native Americans. And in that sense, he's not wrong. It is probably safer for them to not be in constant contact and conflict with the white people, but we can't act around and justify as if it was a noble act on his part. Now, the Cherokee tribe in Georgia is actually going to sue all the way to the Supreme Court and argue that they have a contract with the state of Georgia that gives them the land that they are currently on. And the Supreme Court, led by John Marshall still, is going to actually agree. John Marshall, as you guys know from the last video, is a big fan of honoring contract rights. And here he's going to say, like, yeah, you have this contract. Georgia, you signed it, so you really can't kick them out because they have this contract that gives them the right to that land. Jackson famously is going to say in response to this, John Marshall has made his ruling, let him enforce it, even though it is the president's job to enforce laws. Strongly in this case for Jackson, siding with states' rights and letting Georgia and the national government actually remove these Native Americans. Eventually, once Jackson is out of office, it finally kicks in and takes place, and the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and the other civilized tribes of the Southeast are removed over what's called the Trail of Tears all the way to Oklahoma. On the journey, many of them die. They are given blankets infected with diseases, and terrible things take place. And in my opinion, it's one of the darker periods of American history. Thank you, Andrew Jackson. The second issue for Jackson is tariffs. As you guys know, because it's been a constant theme throughout the class, the northern manufacturer states are more in favor of tariffs, and the southern agriculture states are less in favor of tariffs. Now, Jackson, as a Southerner, is not really a fan of tariffs necessarily, but he is a fan of order and stability, and states not going to do whatever they want. And this is going to cause some tension between him and at his time, his vice president, John C. Calhoun. 1828, before Jackson takes office, that tariff of abominations that I mentioned is passed, and that makes South Carolina very, very angry. Now, yes, they're mad about the tariff, but their real concern is the use of federal power and federal authority. At every turn, the southern states are going to resist a strong, expansive federal government, and they're going to use a lot of reasons to justify why they're opposed to it, but the real fear is that if we let the government do X, Y, or Z, whatever the issue is, then the government's going to come for our slaves. So they're worried about the precedent of letting the government regulate whatever, because their worry is if we let them do that, then they're going to come take away our slaves. In the case of the tariffs, John C. Calhoun is secretly going to write the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, super important document, which really upholds the right of states, any state, in this case South Carolina, but any state has the right to nullify, cancel, or ignore any federal law that really they disagree with. He's now following in the precedent of Jefferson and Madison with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that were anti-alien and sedition acts. But really what the thing here is that he's not arguing on constitutional grounds like Jefferson and Madison were. He's arguing more on states' rights to just veto laws they don't like. So he's going to take Jefferson and Madison's argument a step further with the South Carolina Exposition. Under Jackson, they pass a new tariff in 1832, which lowers the tariff, but it doesn't lower the tariff enough. And the people in South Carolina that really put Jackson in office are going to feel very betrayed by the fact that they still have to deal with this high tariff. The South gets real mad. South Carolina specifically threatens to secede over this issue. They're going to pull out of the Union, which, as we know, they're going to do in 29 years anyway. And in this case, Jackson responds with an incredible show of force, saying, and I quote, "I will go down to South Carolina and I will hang John C. Calhoun from the nearest tree." Not great for lowering tensions in Washington, D.C. So Jackson responds with threat and force. Clay, with his legacy as the great compromiser, Henry Clay comes through with the Compromise Tariff of 1833, which lowers the tariff levels, making South Carolina happy, but also passes what's called the Force Bill, which gives Jackson the right to use the federal government and army to force states to listen to federal law, which makes Jackson happy. So it's a nice little in-between, which lowers tariffs, but allows Jackson still to save face. And it does, in fact, make South Carolina happy for the short term. So the tariff crisis ends. Here's an awesome graph to look at for our rates of how high tariffs are over time. As you can see, South Carolina probably had a right to be mad, since this is the highest point of tariffs at any point in American history. Tariffs are going to fall pretty consistently until the Civil War, which is going to go back up to support the war effort in northern industry. They're going to drop a ton post-Gilded Age, all the way through the early 19 teens, and they reach a very low point. Of course, they're going to rise again as Hoover's response to the Great Depression, as if that was going to fix it, with the Hawley-Smoot tariff, and they've been pretty much declining ever since. However, with our current president just throwing around tariffs like it's his job, like it's a candy bar, who knows where they'll be in the next couple years. Final issue for Jackson is the bank. Jackson hates the Bank of the United States. He thinks it's unconstitutional, despite Marshall's opinion in McCulloch versus Maryland that it is not unconstitutional. He thinks the bank is aristocratic. It only helps the rich. It's run by a den of thieves that are preying on the American public. He just doesn't trust banks. And in the election of 1832, this new national power type of Democratic Republicans are going to try to catch Jackson in a bind so they can beat him in the election. Clay and Webster are going to re-charter or renew the bank early to force Jackson to make a decision on the bank. Either he vetoes it and he makes businesses mad, or he approves it and he makes his supporters mad. Jackson vetoes it anyway, and the election of 32 really does center on this issue of the bank. Jackson wins on a landslide. He defeats Clay again. And Jackson looks at this as a mandate that the American public have spoken on this issue of the bank, and the American public agrees with Jackson's views. Now, Jackson vetoed the bank in 1832. The bank's not going to go away until 1836, but Jackson looks at that election as the American people speaking, and he uses that opportunity to take all federal money out of the bank and put it in state or local banks that are loyal to him, known as pet banks. Now, this is actually going to wreak havoc on the economy 5 years later with the Panic of 1837, but that's not going to be Jackson's problem because he is gone by then. And this is really the issue that begins our second two-party system. This is going to cause the emergence of the Whigs, which originally starts as simply an anti-Jackson coalition in the Democratic Party that are eventually going to form their own full political party. The Whigs are going to be made up of ex-Federalists, the Clay Democratic Republicans that were more in line with the bigger national authority, like Clay and Quincy Adams, and bigger farmers in the West and the South, as well as industrialists in the North. They're going to take a policy similar to the Federalists, but a little wider, which supports a strong, active national government, as well as economic regulation through things like tariffs and banks and so forth. And the Whigs are going to gain a ton of support when the economy tanks in 1837 and the subsequent recession. And this is really going to give us what's our second two-party system. We had from 1790 to 1816, ending with the War of 1812, our Federalists with our Democratic Republicans or Jeffersonian Republicans. And then, of course, our era of good feelings when we only had Democratic Republicans. And then our little split over Jackson's policies into the states' rights group and the national power group that will eventually just become known as Whigs and Democrats. And that party is going to hold true to form until the 1850s, in which slavery is going to divide these guys into North and South, and a new Republican Party is going to absorb what's left of these guys. Now, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't go through this and show you one of my favorite political cartoons of Jackson being portrayed as a king standing on a tattered Constitution of the U.S., a tattered internal improvement plan, and a bank and a book on the floor that is titled The Judiciary of the United States, showing Jackson has taken over all power, vetoing everything he doesn't like, and stepping on the Constitution. This, of course, is the Whig point of view of Jackson, but he's not a king, and he steps down in 1837 after the election of 1836, in which his vice president, Martin Van Buren, is elected. Now, Martin Van Buren only serves one term. He's commonly known as Martin Van Ruin for his very unsuccessful term. Shortly after he takes office, of course, the economy tanks. Is that Van Buren's fault? No, it's Jackson's fault, but he gets blamed for it. The Panic of 1837 goes on for a while. He actually opposes, at this point, annexation of Texas, which makes the Democrats who want to spread slavery mad. And under him, we also see the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which is not that exciting, but it makes me happy, as we are settling our New England territorial disputes between the northern states and Canada. And again, we're settling them diplomatically, this time with the negotiation of Daniel Webster, another name you should know. Van Buren is followed up by William Henry Harrison in a very famous what's called the Log Cabin and Hard Cider campaign, as the Whigs kind of steal a play out of the Democrats' playbook, and they start running a more modern, appeals-heavy campaign with Harrison, showing him as a man of the people who grew up in a log cabin. And he's so tough that he gets pneumonia at his inaugural address, and he dies right after taking office. And that gives us John Tyler as president, who I consider a president without a party, because he's not Whiggish enough for the Whigs, and he's not Democratic enough for the Democrats, so he kind of just hangs out for 3 years and does nothing until annexing Texas at the very, very tail end of his term, once Polk has already been elected. So that hits politics for period 4. The last thing to really tackle are the social revolutions, which really come off of the Second Great Awakening. Now, the Second Great Awakening is similar to the first in that it's a revival of Protestant beliefs and excitement in church. And it really appeals to people's emotions, the excitement of church, the fact that people can go to church and enjoy themselves. But the Second Great Awakening, as opposed to the first, which really emphasized predestination, that you have to be right with God because He already knows where you're going. The second inspires perfectionism. The Second Great Awakening really pushes this idea that humans have an obligation to perfect society around them. That Jesus is coming back soon, and He needs to come back. He'll only come back once the world is perfect and we've fixed all of our problems. So, of course, with that in mind, the Second Great Awakening is going to inspire a whole bunch of social reform movements as people try to then fix those problems they notice in society around them. And the second, as opposed to the first, is really going to see a heavy role played by women and African Americans. Some of these reform movements that you should note. Women are trying to break out of their role, which up to this point has been Republican motherhood, which has evolved into the cult of domesticity, and get involved in fixing society's problems. And we see, really for the first time, a more national approach to abolitionism. We start to see here at the tail end of period 4, people like William Lloyd Garrison getting involved in using literacy and the written word to push abolitionism. As, of course, slavery becomes feeling under attack, we start seeing the Southern response to that, which is the defense of slavery, starting with the gag rule passed in 1836, which banned any conversation of slavery or its abolition or its expansion in Congress. So I consider that a very dark period of Congress in which you're not even going to talk about problems in America. You're going to just put a full gag on the conversation of them. We start seeing utopian communities as people start to leave mainstream society to try to make their own perfect communities. Some of you should know the Oneida community, the Shakers, Brook Farm, and New Harmony in New Jersey. Those communities are important because it's really the first time where we see equality in America. At these utopian communities, we start seeing socialism, where everybody works together, earns together, shares together. We start seeing a whole bunch of women's rights because everybody looks at themselves in these communities as equal. So all these utopian societies are really weird. There are some important things to take from them for society. We start seeing the growth of temperance, or the limiting of alcohol. And that's going to come off of the fact that men are now working out of the house. And then on the way home from work, they're going to stop and spend their whole paycheck at the bar. And then come home and have no money, and life sucks, and it's all sorts of terrible. But we see the American Temperance Society formed, one of the first anti-alcohol organizations, which is really driven by women, who are the ones who bear the brunt of alcohol abuse at home. And there's also a ton of anti-immigrant sentiment in temperance as well. We look at the Germans and the Irish, specifically the Irish, as big consumers of alcohol, and a way of sneaking in some anti-immigrant sentiment without saying you're anti-immigrant is saying you're anti-alcohol. We also see prison reform and asylum reform, as we look at prison instead of a place to just put somebody away forever, as a way to fix people's problems and reform them for society. The name to know there, of course, is Dorothy Dix. We see a huge growth of education reform as we begin as a society to really start investing in education, of course, for the most part in New England, but start looking at education as a place to transfer Enlightenment thought and political philosophy. Um, some names to know there is Catherine Beecher as somebody who begins the idea of training teachers, a big deal. I mentioned in class, and it's worth noting again, the existence of Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio. It's one of the very first places in all of American society in which white men, white women, and African Americans are seen as equals. It really becomes the hotbed of the abolition and women's rights movement of Oberlin College because they're all treated there as equals. And of course, the name Horace Mann, who really revolutionizes the educational system in Massachusetts as a way to create a much more educated populace that can engage in politics. So all of that really comes off of really two things. The first is the Second Great Awakening, and the second are the problems that have stemmed up from the Market Revolution. All of this is going to really come to its apex with the Seneca Falls Convention, in 1848, at the very tail end of Period 4, in which women hold a huge convention led by two names you should know, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And what comes out of it is basically the same thing comes out of the Second Continental Congress, and that's a Declaration of Independence. But in this case, it's women taking the Declaration of Independence and really tweaking it to fit the fact that all men and women are created equal. And much like the Declaration of Independence did, this declaration is going to make a whole bunch of really detailed complaints against society. But this time, instead of complaining against King George III and Parliament, they're going to complain about the fact that a patriarchal, male-driven society has given them no rights legally, no rights politically, no rights socially, and they are done having it. Now, it's a super important document. It's a super important event. Of course, as you guys know, women don't actually get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment in 1919. And they don't actually ever get an Equal Rights Amendment, which, as you guys know, is eventually put down by the states in the 1970s and 80s amidst the rise of growth of conservatism. So, super important document and an event that really shows the apex of Period 4's social reform movements. And it's important to understand this growth of ability of women to get involved in social reform movements and then start asking for themselves, like, hey, I need some rights too. So Seneca Falls is super important. Please know it. Cool. So to recap our Period 4, we start our Period 4 with Federalists and Democratic Republicans with the election of 1800. We end our Period 4 with Whigs and Democrats as the Federalists die and the Whigs really rise to take their place as that Democratic Republican Party splits over the presidency of Jackson. We have the Second Great Awakening, which inspires reform movements. That's the big difference from that in the first. We see a bunch of new technological inventions. Steamboat, you should know. Cotton gin, you should know. Spinning jenny, you should know. Factory system, Samuel Slater, you should know. You should understand the market revolution and its impact, how it changes our economy, how it changes our society, and then, of course, how it also then goes hand in hand with attracting old immigration, these Irish and Germans that are coming in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, as opposed to the new immigration we're going to cover in Period 6 of more Eastern, Southern Europeans, and other parts of the world. You got to know the Missouri Compromise in 1820 and its role on slavery and the precedent going forward of keeping the states equal between slaveholding and non-slaveholding. And it's important to understand the era of Jackson and the fact that demonstrates the growth of modern politics as everyday people are allowed to vote, and therefore our political system then represents everyday type of people. So, thanks for watching. Hope it was helpful. Make sure you jot down any questions or confusions you still have so we can surface them in class on Monday. And I will see you then. Thanks, guys.